Good evening. I want to thank Maziar for making this very, very important movie about this dark phenomena that has been a very integral part of repression in Iran. I'm Hadi Gaimi, Executive Director of the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran. And we talk on a daily basis with former prisoners and detainees collecting their testimonies. And these forced confessions are so routine to their experiences. And Maziar has brought it now to global audiences in a very powerful, tangible way, telling the stories of the people in the film who are truly creme de la creme of Iranian intelligentsia who have experienced it. Now, as Iran is a major foreign policy issue and you cannot pick up the paper and not have a story on Iran, and almost always it is about the nuclear issue. And let's not forget that the struggle of 75 million Iranians, their struggle for basic freedoms, for human dignity is much more important to them than the nuclear issue. And Maziar's film sheds some light on that. The Iranian people today are really caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand is the severe repression that has been getting worse and worse, especially since 2009. And on the other hand are these crippling sanctions that are making their lives harder and harder by the day. And if they're maintained in their present form, there is no doubt we will be facing a humanitarian crisis in Iran. Now, Iranian journalists have always been on the forefront of confronting the repression. And I'm amazed at how year after year, no matter how many of them are detained, imprisoned, tortured, killed, forced into exile, there is always a new generation coming. Just this new group of people who were detained, if you look at them, most of them just a few years ago, no one knew about them. But it is such a society, and journalism is such a powerful way for the Iranian youth to confront the injustices of their society. And tonight's panel is going to focus on the current state of media and repression of journalists in Iran and the broader region. Maziar will be joined by Joel Simon, Executive Director of CPJ, and of course in a conversation with John Stewart, who needs no introduction, just suffice to say that he has been a vital voice of sanity and has brought us inspiration, hope, and laughter, especially during some very dark times of recent memories. So we're grateful to him for that. So Maziar, John, and Joel, please.
Maziar, what, in your mind, why are you out? Why are you not still one of those journalists?
Simply because of the amazing campaign that organizations like CPJ and PAN, Index on Censorship, and many other people who didn't know me, and they just identified with my plight and campaigned for me. That's the reason I'm here. And whenever people ask me what to do, should we sign a petition or should we write to our representatives, I say yes, because each of these things, the Iranian government is not like the North Korean government. It really cares about its image in the world. When Ahmadinejad comes to New York, he would love to be treated like Juan Carlos and go to Metropolitan Opera and, you know, enjoy the life in New York. He doesn't like to be ridiculed. But I think this ridiculing him, criticizing him and the regime and Ayatollah Khamenei, I think it's very important, and it just gives a positive energy to the people, to the activists, to the people who will get arrested in the near future.
Let me ask you, one of the crucial questions is, do you think that they believe that you are a spy working at the nexus of a hub from the CIA to Europe to Israel, or is this part of a more cynical pattern of intimidation, or is it both?
No. They genuinely believe that. They believe in one entity which they call the global arrogance. And if you
That'd be us, right? I think that'd probably be us. Or we'd be at least around the center of that, right?
Yeah. And, well, some of it, but the thing about the Iranian government is that they have some genuine grievances. They have, because the American government, you know better than many other people that the foreign policy of the American government has never been perfect. And it's been actually very much imperfect. So
Is this being recorded?
I'm being deported tomorrow.
Yeah.
So they have genuine grievances against the American government, of course, the British Empire, and they mix that phobia, that genuine fear, with certain myths, certain lies, and certain beliefs. And they keep on repeating these lies, and they start believing it. So within this entity, they don't think that there are different elements that are, they're not all evil or they're not all Zionists. My interrogator used to tell me that it's common knowledge that all the editors of American magazines and newspapers are part of the intelligence apparatus. And I was like, well, common knowledge, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that's possible, but I don't know where did you get that from. No. I mean, I didn't argue with him, of course, but but he genuinely believed that. So me, as someone who is working for Newsweek, I am I'm an agent of John Meacham and Fareed Zakaria, who are as important in the CIA as George Tenet, and
And that's where the line gets blurred, because you do have, in this country we don't talk about 1953, and we don't talk about Mossadegh, and we don't talk about the overthrow of a regime and in the installation of a dictator, but in Iran that is an enormous historical point of fact.
Exactly.
And they can take that and, as you say, build that into many different other narratives that may not exist, that are phantoms.
For Iranians, short-term memory is like 2,500 years ago. So they still are talking about the glorious Persian Empire, which existed like 2,500 years ago. And if it was so glorious, how could a bunch of, as they say, lizard eaters, Arabs, could take over the empire? So these are the things that, that the Iranians are, and the Iranian government is, is a master in manipulating people's genuine fears and twisting it to its own advantage.
Mm-hmm. Is there something to the idea, too, that they consider you an enemy of the state, and the fact that you are chronicling what they are actually doing, are they right? Are you dangerous to them? Because what is more dangerous to them than the knowledge and the witnessing of some of their intimidation and brutality?
Well, yeah, I think if they consider themselves as a closed system, whatever, I mean, every closed system can be damaged by exposure. It doesn't matter what system that is. And if it's a political system, and what journalists do is that they just shed light on different corners of this corrupt, inefficient, wrong, and at the same time, ideological system. And that can be regarded as dangerous if you're short-sighted and if you think about your short-term interest. Some people within the Iranian government, they're wise. They know that they had to let people like me operate in Iran. And that's why I managed to work as a journalist and filmmaker for 11 years in Iran before the Revolutionary Guards arrested me. And they were telling me that we are going to even arrest the people who allowed you to work. Because those people, they cannot tolerate any criticism. And they just don't want to bend until they break, of course. But there are certain members of the Iranian government who are reformists, who know that they have to change and they have to somehow accept the criticism of the younger generation. I mean, the Iranian population, 75% of Iranians are under the age of 30. It is a generation who grew up after the revolution. They do not believe in the ideals of my generation, and especially our parents' generation.
Do you find that there's also, within it, I think Americans have an idea of torture and intimidation that's primarily shaped by action movies where you grab somebody and you say, but where's the bomb? And you torture them and they'll tell you, and then you can go and the school will be fine and everybody will be good. There is a bureaucratic nature to this that I think is really interesting in that there was ultimately no purpose for your abuse. They didn't take that information and attain a goal with it. It was just, in some respects, busy work.
The specific abuse that I suffered was for propaganda purposes.
Yes.
It's as if you're recruiting an actor and he doesn't want to cooperate and you beat him, and some directors apparently do that. But, and if we regard my Ayatollah Khamenei as the head of a studio, and then you have all these torturers as directors, and they were treating people like me, like actors who did not want to act out this really crappy script that they had. And there were bad lines, there was a bad plot. And what happened after 2009 elections was really like a bad decision into making a big blockbuster, like, Waterworld. That, that they had a vague idea for a plot. They had a very bad script and it was half finished. And then but they had a lot of resources. They have the oil money, they have the gas money, they have the army, and they started to arrest people like me, and they could do that. They could do that within 2 or 3 days. They arrested thousands of people. But then, what should they do with that?
Right.
Okay, like Kevin Costner, he had the money that Hollywood gave him, and he had all the resources. What did he do? He came up with a really bad film.
Right.
And the Iranian government realized that as well.
Here's what I appreciate most about Maziar. He will go with my stupid metaphor, and a normal person might say, well, that's kind of stupid, but he'll follow me with it, and that's why we're friends. But ultimately, it's almost a case of once, the forced confession is the aim. And then the aim of that is intimidation or something, but people have started to tune it out. So then they move on and they just keep people going through that system in kind of a cycle, as though they don't really know what else to do.
Forced confession is a method that they use for different purposes. In the beginning of the revolution, it was quite effective because it was scaring the opposition. It was making the followers of the regime believe in the depravity and corruption of the opposition as well. And it's, and it was, I remember, like, as I say in the film, I remember in the beginning of it was just horrifying to see dozens of people every night on television confessing to all sorts of crimes. And then the regime, of course, one of the things about the authoritarian regimes is that they're lazy. They do not come up with new ideas. They're not inventive. And if they were inventive, they wouldn't be authoritarian dictatorships. So they use the same method over and over again. So by the time of my confession, or especially these days, they use forced confessions on anyone. They just arrest someone off the street and they say, okay, you have to confess. And they have thousands of tapes, I'm sure, some, or maybe MP4s or MP3s, somewhere that they're using eventually for whatever purposes they want. They're just used to this. They're just used to forcing people to confess. They're just used to beating up people. And this is a regime that is not thinking about 10 years ahead, even 5 years ahead. They're thinking about next month, next year.
I think there's another dynamic that's at play, which is prisoners, I've seen this in just defending all the journalists who've been put in jail, they see them as hostages. And they once they invest all that time and energy, they want to extract something. Mm-hmm. They're just like kidnappers who fed someone, kept them for a long time. At that point, their mindset is, well, we'll let them go, but we got to get something in return. And there's some sort of negotiation in terms of some sort of international concession. To them, I think the forced confessions are in some ways the ransom. They're the ransom that you pay.
Yeah.
And I think that's an element as well.
And it's also, I think we shouldn't forget the entertainment value of these things for them. Because you're talking about people who live in dark rooms. They work in dark rooms. They basically spend about 12, 13 hours a day in a dark room, beating up people, insulting people. And for them, they need some sort of entertainment. And somebody confessing to things that sometimes they dream about. Like, actually, I have to thank Omid Memarian, who's in the audience and who's in the film. And, like his interrogator was forcing him to describe a sexual act that never existed and then ask him to talk about the details of it.
Right.
It's sick because that guy really was enjoying what Omid was telling him. And it happened in my case. And in many other cases, it happened the same thing. So I think we have to we have to talk about the entertainment, like the twisted entertainment value
Right.
of that. And for the regime
it
as a whole.
perverts an entire system, and there's a bureaucracy of that torture that becomes perverted. But then you wonder, so they've extracted the ransom, but then they don't let them go. So now they're still there, and they haven't left. Maziar is forced to confess, and they don't let him go. And they continue to intimidate and to beat and to do these things until the day that they realize the international community has an interest in you. And then they let you go. So how did they reconcile the time that they kept you there, and how did they rationalize that you were a spy, that they got to confess, that they continued to beat, that they suddenly had to let go?
I don't think we can talk about anything rational in this case because, if you think about things rationally, of course, I've started this new website, Iran Wire, and they called me the official agent of the CIA the other day in conservative newspapers and blogs and websites. And someone who came in the guise of a journalist to Iran in 2009, and he's an official agent of the CIA. And I sent them an email asking them, how can I be the official agent? You put me through so much interrogation, you couldn't find a shred of evidence except for my interview with Jason Jones on the Daily Show. And that was an important evidence. But
I remember.
But besides that, there is no other evidence. And what do you mean by official agent? Have you seen my pay slip? What does it mean? But of course, they didn't reply to my email, and they will never do that because they are just saying things to satisfy themselves, and they say things that they think can convince their followers. And the followers somehow listen to them and are convinced until they are taking advantage of the regime. They have a material advantage in the longevity of the regime. As soon as that material interest, as soon as they cut off their rations, as soon as they cut off their overtime payments, their bonuses, then you will see that even those torturers, they do not believe in.
Right. How much is ideology? How much is corruption and greed?
It's because the regime has been based on a lie, when you're talking about an Islamic Republic, according to the Ayatollah Khomeini's interpretation of Islam, it's a lie itself, because Khomeini's interpretation of Islam does not have to do anything with the republic. So the regime is based on a myth and a lie, and it's been continuing for the past 34 years. So it's a corrupt regime based on a lie, and ideology and corruption, they're intertwined now in Iran. And it's very difficult to say what percentage, because there are some ideological people who are good people in the system, some good bureaucrats who are just, opportunists like any other regime, like in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, like during the Nazi regime. They are just opportunists who are just bureaucrats and they want to live.
Right.
But there are many people who are corrupt, like this guy Mortazavi, who we show in the film. He is the head of the welfare organization in Iran. He is someone who sent people to a prison called Kahrizak, and he got them killed.
Right.
And he just lies. I mean, people, Omid is here, and he can tell you that when people talk to Mortazavi, he just wants to lie. He called me once, and he said that you just have to tell what I'm telling you. And I just left the country for a few months just, for him to forget my name. But some people don't have the opportunity to do that.
That's the interesting thing to me as well, is the sort of oddly personal and collegial communications that you then establish with people who tortured and intimidate you, like the idea, so this was my torturer, so I emailed him, and I was going to just send him an IM, but I don't have the direct, and it's a strange, and they try to ingratiate with themselves with you in some regard, and it becomes a very strange relationship.
In a sense, people like me, journalists who live part-time outside of Iran, people who are from a different social class, economic class, we are living a life that these people, they like to live. Mm-hmm. Some of them think that when they die and they go to paradise, they leave the people that we live, that they can have girlfriends, they can travel to Paris and, to New Jersey, and, so
nice.
As a result, they're envious of us. And in a sense, it's like it's this mixture of hatred and envy that
right.
You are going to New Jersey. I love to go to New Jersey, but first I have to do my duty, and then I can go to New York. This is just
Well, I can help them with the New Jersey part. But this is where it gets, I think here's where it gets tricky, so we can broaden it out. So it's easy to talk about Iran, and it's easy to demonize their practices, and many of them rightfully so. But America has allies and countries that we are absolutely counting on the side of our friends, whose record on these types of issues are no better and sometimes worse than what we're talking about with a country that we very easily can dismiss as evil and an enemy. So how do we reconcile those situations as well?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is Iran. We've heard about the terrible conditions in Iran. It is the second worst jailer of journalists in the world. The worst jailer of journalists in the world is Turkey. And Turkey,
a NATO ally.
Yes, NATO ally, candidate for membership in the EU, according to President Obama, a model for democracy in the Middle East. And yet it's the world's leading jailer of journalists. It's not as brutal and repressive as Iran, obviously, but it uses repressive laws to crack down on dissent. And what's really scary about the strategy that's employed in Turkey is it's all based on the kind of war on terror rhetoric. Basically, critical journalists are conflated with terrorists. They're all in jail under sort of anti-terror type laws, some because of their involvement with Kurdish separatists, some because of their involvement with kind of ultra-nationalist alleged plots to overthrow the government. So it's all under the anti-terror rubric. And this, as I said, is a country. Obama's actually going to be meeting with Erdogan next week. They're buddies. They got to work together on the nuclear issue in Iran, on Syria, and yet this is the world's leading journalist.
I mean, to hear about a country that's using a war on terrorism to restrict.
Shocking, shocking.
Well, it's certainly it's thank God we live in America. But the important thing is, that is the complication too over there is. Everybody has alliances with everyone else for different purposes, and you're not quite sure. Even those that, for their base, they would say Israel is the worst, and we must destroy them. But if they wanted to, bomb Syria, we wouldn't mind because we don't. You have Saudi Arabia on one side. There's all these different alliances that have matched up. And how do you, as an organization, cut through some of those complexities?
Well, I mean, really what we're doing is trying to be as consistent as we can in the defense of journalists and define broadly. Really what journalists are part of is a broader information dynamic, and that's at the root of power and control in every one of these countries. Sometimes, as in Syria, it plays out in incredibly brutal ways. But if you look at what's happening in Syria, yes, it's a conflict over physical territory, but it's also a conflict over who controls information. 28 journalists have died in Syria. Those are numbers we haven't seen since the Iraq War. In Egypt, certainly during the revolution, that was also, was about who controls Tahrir Square, who controls that physical space, but it was also about who controls information, who controls the narrative. And that's critically important across the region, across the Middle East, and really across the globe. Struggles for power these days are also about who controls information.
Do you see, as technology advances, must the regimes become more brutal because of how much more agile and nimble the technology and the journalists have become? And is that the only way for them to stay ahead of everything that can get information?
That is part of the dynamic. It's
Right.
really interesting. We've seen there are more journalists in jail around the world today than CPJ, our organization that's been around for over 30 years. We've never seen so many journalists jailed around the world, 232 journalists in jail all over the world. I think that it is harder to control information and that more sophistication and sometimes more brutality is needed. If you look at what's happening even in Iran, this is a regime that tolerated for a very long time a certain amount of critical commentary in the media. I mean, Maziar will tell you, Tehran had a very, very rich journalism culture. People would read, the conservative and the reformist newspapers, and there'd be this ongoing debate. And then when they shut down the media, the whole debate just moved online. And people feel a very strong urge to communicate and debate these issues, and I think it's getting harder and harder for governments to control it. They're using the technology to control it as well. I mean, you can't perceive the technology as always giving an advantage.
No, of course
not. Governments use the technology too to suppress information.
Yeah, I mean,
No, they reverse the technology.
Yeah, they reverse it. They reverse
And
it.
talking about American allies, Iran, even though I've made this film about Iran and we are talking about the suppression in Iran, Iran is still freer than Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, which are American allies. And there are more journalists in jail in Iran because there are journalists in Iran.
That's a good point. Yeah.
In Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, they just nip it in the bud, and they don't even allow journalism or newspapers to start. So, but they have, they allow American military presence. But if you want, if we're going to talk about hypocrisy of American foreign law.
Is that what we're talking about?
I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, but I'm happy to go where you want to go with this conversation. It's whatever.
You should watch The Daily Show.
Nah, it's crass. I don't care for it. We talk about technology as changing sort of the playing field for that. Does that also change the definition of journalists?
Yeah, sure.
Does it then, the advent of blogs and the web and almost this idea of journalism being just the ability to bear witness?
Yeah.
And how does that change the difficulty of your job and
Well,
who they're.
I mean, I was just in Egypt, and what was really interesting is we were talking to lots of journalists, and I asked them, can you tell me the difference between journalism and activism? And they all said no. There really is no line. And then I talked to bloggers and activists, and they were describing what they were doing, and they were documenting things that were happening at demonstrations and tweeting about it and reaching a broad audience. And I said, well, don't you think that's journalism? And they said, no, not really. And I said, well, I do. And so, yes, it's very, very hard to define where journalism ends, where activism begins,
right.
particularly in a place like
And
Egypt.
this is something that
Yep.
the governments, they have not fathomed yet, and that scares them, and they're fighting against it. If we explain, I mean, if we describe journalism as gathering information and disseminating information, or putting an already existing information in a new context, people are using it as a weapon to gain their rights, or to fight the power, whatever power can be. It can be the big corporations in the US, it can be the dictatorship in Burma, it can be the corruption of the caste system in India. So people are using it because of the technology. I was in India covering an organization called CGNet. It is based in a place in India that does not have internet connection. It's just a mobile phone journalism device that people just call a number. That number records their messages. It goes on a website. It transcribes it, and then it becomes journalists. So the poorest people, the lower caste in India, they are becoming journalists, and they are using journalism in order to gain their rights.
And I think the point of sort of bringing it up is, we define the issue as 232 journalists, being held around the world. But the truth of the matter is, I think the numbers you would have to look at and say it is vastly higher because of that changing definition and these other individuals that are disseminating information, that are doing that are also being jailed but don't yet have sort of the banner of being journalists, yet are in jail for the very same, what they would, these repressive regimes would define as crime. And isn't this, an almost geometric problem from that one smaller group?
And I think that governments recognize that, anyone can be a journalist in any particular moment, and the dynamic at demonstrations, for example, and we saw this in Iran. So the most iconic images that came out of those demonstrations, Neda dying on the street, that was not shot by a professional journalist. That was the iconic image from that moment, and that's happening more and more. And then you have groups, human rights groups that are involved in contemporaneous documentation. It's really a form of journalism. So yes, the landscape is changing dramatically. I think the Middle East in some ways is kind of the leading edge because of the nature of the protests there, but this is a global phenomenon.
Right. Now, I think we did want to open it up to some in the audience who might wanted to ask some questions, so I thought we'd do that as well. Yes, it's a relatively small audience, so I think we can do it maybe without the mic, but let's see. Back in the back there, yeah. Well, let's get him the mic, because maybe we can. Project, young man, project!
So they've already started jailing journalists right before the election's going to start. What should we be looking for? So when something happens so that we can amplify, if there are more demonstrations during the election, if all these journalists are already in jail, where should we be looking? So when they start covering stuff, we can be there to amplify and make sure it doesn't get pushed under the rug.
Well, I think many journalists are using social networks like Facebook and Twitter right now in Iran in order to report. But there are some websites as well. But I think social media, they are the good places to look at. But one thing that you have to do first is to learn Persian, because the genuine, correct information is in Persian, because when you see it in English, it goes through different filters, and then it's not. I mean, sometimes it's old, and sometimes it's not the right information. Sometimes it's simplified in order for others to understand. I suggest to, if you're genuinely interested in Iran and news, to have an Iranian friend who can translate it for you, or learn Persian.
And also, you know, one of the ways that they're controlling it this time around is they just haven't announced candidates. The election is in, what, 3 weeks, 4 weeks?
14th of June, yes.
The 14th of
I mean,
June.
that's what the Revolutionary Guard said, that, you know, they said this time it is our duty to engineer the elections. And so that's what they're doing.
Right. Let's do right over there, so I'll try and make it easier on you, not to have to walk through. And,
What do the
So the
three
back
of you see as the future of press freedom, not only in Iran, but kind of across the world? I imagine that the three of you probably have pretty similar views, but maybe they differ slightly. You know, where do you see the press freedom organizations looking at next? Is it at, you know, the micro journalists who use Twitter, or is it kind of a broad picture still?
Well, I think that the press freedom groups like CPJ will have a much more difficult time in the future, because we'll see more journalists, citizen journalists, appearing all around the world. And the description, the definition of journalist is changing. And I think there will be more groups like CPJ.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say something heretical, and you know, I just sometimes wonder what press freedom really means anymore. I mean, because that's just a concept which, you know, is in some ways is antiquated. It refers to print press, which is, you know, not necessarily the dominant medium through which people express ideas. So it's you know, I think the challenge for us is evolving and adapting to the new reality, and recognizing that people communicate and share information, document information in different ways, and ensuring that we are in a position to defend that broader struggle, and not just narrowly focused on professional journalists.
right. And I tend to think that as long as regimes view it as a privilege and not a right, you will always be fighting that battle, because it will always then be free until you say something. You know, we talk about our friend Bassem Youssef, who, when he spoke out and ridiculed Mubarak, was hailed by, you know, many as the revolution took hold. Now that he has decided to wear a giant hat and make fun of Morsi, they have decided that the privilege is no longer operating.
And I see his function, and as very, we defend him as a journalist. We
Right.
see his role as journalistic, and that's clear to us.
And I think people are realizing the power of satire as well.
Right.
And that's why I think
Not in this country.
no, and I think not because John's here, but I think he's become like a role model for many people around the world. We know about Bassem, but there are other people who are doing it on YouTube. And I think people are realizing how powerful satire can be, because they have to compete. Even the citizen journalists, they have to compete for attention. And I think satire is a way to grab the attention of the audiences in different
And do you know that John, you know that you're under investigation for insulting the president in Egypt? That the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood have asked that you be investigated and the charges be brought. So I hope you're not planning a trip, a vacation, you know, cruise up the Nile or anything.
I was, there's a sandals resort there. I was. You know, I think that satire can still be a powerful weapon, especially in a culture where they're still carving out that space of free expression, because it can be, in some respects, a Trojan horse that allows the space to be carved out before people recognize it. I think it's probably less so in cultures where that is already settled law, where it is still, I think, you know, editorializing and still commentary, but it does not have the power or the it doesn't take the courage that it takes in countries where it is the leading edge, the tip of the spear that is carving out those pockets of expression.
And it's very strange that the funniest people are in dictatorships. I see Iranians, I mean, Iranians are very funny, Russians are very funny, Egyptians are funny. And, you know, they live in these dictatorships and you don't see, you know, Swedish or, you know, German. It's,
So social democracies are not funny.
It's just very strange that,
It's not
you know,
funny.
yeah. Maybe dictatorship.
Once you get
creates-
8 weeks paid vacation, you know, you can complain about how hard it is to put the furniture together, but other than that. Whereas, you know, and a lot of that is based on, you know, it's very interesting. Creativity often is seen as a result of freedom. But in many respects, creativity is the result of limits and parameters. And when you are fighting against, you know, Lenny Bruce died for my sins, so that's already been done. You know, once you have Def Comedy Jam on HBO, there's really nothing I can't say anymore. You know, it's already out there. But when you live in regimes that are limiting your feet, that's when the most creative and most interesting and most inspired material comes from, because it has to, because they have to find the seams, and it's an interesting process to watch.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It was a great movie. And I have a question. What do you think the people who are journalists or activists on this side of the world, when they make a comment or they make their voice be heard, their family, we all have like families living back home. How would this affect their life? And what is the best way to approach? Because if you want to have a voice and you have a right, but still your family and they have a right, and you're connected, how can you actually work and make this work for everybody? And I have a question for John. And why, when it comes to people, the Western world, or, you know, nobody talks, and when it comes to nuclear bomb, all of a sudden, all the Western world become together and, you know, try to control, but still people's life is not that important. Right. During the protest, we saw that the United States did nothing. Thank you.
You want to go first? Or?
I think both questions are equally complicated.
They are equally complicated. I think speaking to the first point, I think that's an incredibly shrewd observation, because losing control of the individual and their ability to spread that information to other places, they find the only pressure points that they can still apply intimidation to, and that is family. Yeah. And that must be very difficult. Yeah.
In terms of family and your responsibility towards your family, I think it's up to each individual to think for herself or himself. I cannot really tell you what one should do, because there are different scenarios for different people. But the Iranian regime has realized that, and since a couple of years ago, they've started to intimidate the families of the journalists who work for foreign media, especially the BBC inside Iran. These are the people who work for BBC Persian service in London, but the Iranian regime intimidates their families who live inside Iran. And there have been cases of Facebook interrogation, that they are interrogating someone who is in London through Facebook chat, Skype interrogation. And these are the new methods that the Iranian regime is using, because, and I think the reason for that is this fear of a new thing. Iranian regime basically is a 20th century dictatorship that is operating in 21st century. It is a regime that's able to shut down shortwave radio and newspapers, but when it comes to the internet and satellite television, it doesn't know what to do. So it uses the same methods that it was using in the 20th century. And I think it's just starting to learn how to cope with the new technology.
Even when you saw in 2009 when the regime would try and shut down access to the internet or ISPs, people would go Bluetooth and they would go device to device. And the individual's creativity in those situations was a remarkable way of adapting to that. The other part of it was about why does the West only care about nuclear, as their spokesman. I can tell you it's a superficial thing that we do. But no, I don't. I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. But you meant like that they're always focused on, you know, sanctions and things to not allow people to have nuclear programs, yet they're very willing to overlook humanitarian. Yeah, yeah, that's fucked up. Yeah, I don't know how else to describe it.
Speaking about the sanctions, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how they're impacting on the lives of journalists and people who are trying to create change in Iran.
Well, Iranians in general, they are suffering from sanctions, blanket sanctions, wrong sanctions, and journalists are no exception. And in terms of journalists, specifically how they're suffering from sanctions, well, the price of paper has risen. The publishing houses, they are charging more for printing. But this is not the main challenge for the journalists. I think they are suffering with other Iranians. And I think these blanket sanctions that have been in place for the past few years, they're creating a sort of resentment that the American government and the other countries are not thinking about at the moment. And they are going to have long-term consequences. And because, as I said, Iranians, they have very long-term memory. And in 20 years' time, when someone's sister or someone's cousin has died because of the lack of medicine and because of lack of medical facilities, they remember that. And the regime has done a very good job in terms of blaming the sanctions for its own inefficient policies and management of the country. I think the sanctions are, some of the sanctions, I think they are just and they should be in place, like sanctioning the human rights abusers and the Iranian television, for example, or the nuclear program. But some of the banking sanctions are just too broad and they're hurting everyone. Of course, the American government, when you go to the Treasury, they say that we give these permissions called OFAC for the Iranian government to import Iranian companies to import goods from the US. But banks are so intimidated by the Treasury that they do not give letters of credit to Iranian companies in order to import goods. And as a result, many Iranians are suffering from lack of medical equipment, food, medicine, and Iranian industries are suffering at the same time. So whenever Iranians in the diaspora, they ask me what can we do about the sanctions and the situation outside of Iran, I always tell them, use your power to vote and get in touch with your representative. Because I think the American Congress is just, I know that you love your congressman, but I have to say that is somehow composed of the most inept and unintelligent people that I've met in my whole life. And these welcome. And these people are in charge of the policies that the United States is carrying out. And I talked to the people at the State Department and Department of Defense, and they are really frustrated by the Congress as well. So if you're an Iranian living outside, if you're an American, and if you care about Iran, just get in touch with your representative, mobilize yourselves, and pressure them, because that's the right that you have in this country, and most of you are not using that. And in Iran, people do not have that right.
The thing that gets people released is pressure, is international pressure, and people speaking up and voicing the criticism. With so many people imprisoned or killed, how do you keep that group of people from becoming faceless, from becoming a large number?
It's really, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is hard. I mean, first of all, one of the things you see about Maziar's film is in every case there was some sort of international outcry, and the key.
Except for one who ended up killing himself.
Yeah.
There was no international outcry for him.
And the key indicator that this is effective is the fact that every time somebody is arrested in Iran, the government tells the family, just be quiet, and it'll be resolved. That's your key, that is the wrong approach. The more noise, the better. But it's hard, because the more, and this is like a sad irony, the more people who are arrested, the more people who are in jail, the more there's a turnstile of people going in and out, the harder it is to humanize and develop global campaigns around these individuals. There's one journalist that we awarded, we gave one of our awards to, Maziar Bahari, who exposed systematic rape in Kazarek detention center, and as a result of this, he was imprisoned. There was an outcry in Iran, and the facility was shut down. And as a result of the international outcry, he was released briefly on furlough, and then he was rearrested and forced to go back to jail. And that's the dynamic we're seeing. So it's really an excellent question. It's a challenge. I mean, Maziar, maybe you have some thoughts, but it really is critically important that we humanize
I know that
people.
it's very difficult, but I think you have to, unfortunately, choose a face.
Yeah.
That's why we chose, for example, Sattar Beheshti's case in this film, because if you have too many characters, if you have too many prisoners, as you say, they become numbers. But also you have to be sure that if you are campaigning for one person, it doesn't mean that you are ignoring others. You are pressuring the regime to change its behavior towards that person, and that change of behavior will have an effect for other people as well.
Sir, right there in the middle.
You choose death or exile or shutting up. And so every 10 years or so, when a generation arises, they throw them into exile, and although it bothers them, they make noise overseas, it doesn't really challenge them. So how do you think you get to the point where the criticisms provoke change instead of exile?
Well, it's a question that all the exiles are asking themselves, that I shouldn't have left the country. But again, it's up to the individual to see if he or she is more effective outside of the country or not. And the Iranian regime thinks that forced confessions is effective. And it has been effective for 30 years, but it's losing its effect. And when you think about Iran's history, more than 3,000 years of history, these 30 years is just a small pimple on Iran's history. So this is a regime that's thinking about its short-term interest. Yes, if you think that you can get rid of your critics, the reformists, and don't reform yourself, and finally collapse and implode or explode, then that's fine. You can think that you're successful. But if you are a regime who thinks that it can export a revolution, can be a role model, as Ahmadinejad says, for other civilizations, this is not the way to go about your doing your business. And that is the fundamental difference between the Iranian regime and other dictatorships, that there are certain people within the Iranian regime who unfortunately have the power right now, that they just don't want to learn. When forced confessions started in Stalinist era in the early 1940s, in the early 1930s in Stalinist era. It was with, like, they had 3 major trials. One was with like 20 people, another one with 21 people, 22 people. And then they realized that it's not as effective anymore. In Czechoslovakia, they had it in the early 50s. And when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, they thought that they should have the forced confessions, and they said that, no, it's not effective anymore, because they were thinking more long-term than the Iranian regime. So I think when we are talking about effective, we have to think about the longer history and the future of Iran. And I think it's losing its effect, as I said in the film, and it's going to damage the government much more, and it's creating much more resentment than anything that the government can gain from these forced confessions.
If I could just get a sense of the film you're making, John, about the book Maziar has written, anything you can say about it?
I would say get the book
We've done that. Just
and read it. It's really it follows the book. The only difference is the only character I've added is Shaquille O'Neal will play a wizard, and it's the way he gets out, and obviously a small boy who learns a lesson.
And the secret,
we'll talk about.
And the secret is that it's going to be 3D animation. So you will see me.
It's a DreamWorks,
3D.
exactly.
Yeah.
He's my Scrat.
And first, I want to commend you on the movie, on the book, and in a way, thank you for being in prison, because you started this partnership that could be our way to a lot of good things for our country. What I wanted to know was, out of all these stories and interesting people that you see and you meet, what really drew you? I understand there's a friendship there, but thank you for being a part of our cause. But what drew you to this plight that we have, and sort of in wanting to help us and trying to get some light on our cause for Iranians and our country?
Well, Maziar we had sent some people to Iran
Yes.
right before the 2009 election. Coincidentally, it was not based on a journalistic instinct. It just took us 2 years to get somebody in there. And the basic premise of the piece was Iran had been designated as the axis of evil. So we wanted to send a correspondent there to meet this evil, because we'd want to know, like in the Harry Potter books, how you fight it. So, but it turned out that they, in Iran, eat food and talk and have families and love and laugh and things. We spoke with, Maziar was kind enough to speak with our correspondent, and a cleric named Abdahi and an older gentleman named Ibrahim Yazdi. And then the terrible things began to occur, and they were all arrested. So it was born out of a Jewish sense of guilt, quite frankly. So if in any way that is what makes the story so compelling, is the real Zionist conspiracy is me trying to make good for whatever terrible damage we did to this incredibly funny and smart and lovely young man. We are very willing to protect the freedom of people to speak and have elections in other countries. There's one catch. You have to elect somebody that we like. And if you don't, then we get very upset and believe that there must be a problem with your democracy. And that maybe there's a dictator we could find who's nice, stable. That's what we're, then we all become like, if only he had a nice, stable dictator, it'd be nice. I think it has been a very difficult question for America in terms of its policy to be consistent, because quite frankly, it's not even consistent now. As Maziar brought up early, it's very easy to demonize Iran's government for the way they treat journalists, yet here they are with journalists. And yet there are countries that we are absolutely allied with that have much more difficult relationships with freedom than they do. And I don't think it's something that we're consistent on in any way, shape, or form. And the only thing I will say on our behalf is I don't know of any country that does not at some level have a selfishness about its policy that is I think it's very easy then to go the other way with the generalization and construe America's foreign policy as malevolent when it may just be as sort of selfish and somewhat myopic as any country in that thing. It just so happens it's one of the larger, more powerful countries within that. It's very hard to point to a country and go, hey, those guys, they always do right. You know what I mean? Like it's a difficult question, but you're right.
Well, I guess what I meant was that let's say if we had a...
Wait, I answered that whole fucking thing and it wasn't even the right question. Are you serious? I was killing it up here! Son of a bitch. No, go ahead. What did you mean? I apologize, because I thought I had the right thing, man, and I was on a roll. I was like...
let's say if we had a Republican president right now, you think our attitude was different towards Morsi right now, or in Turkey, in terms of like the relationship?
No, I don't think there's that much daylight. I mean, we've gone 5 years without invading anybody. That's something. But in terms of the attitude, no, I don't think. Look, the greatest goal of George W. Bush was spreading freedom and democracy, wasn't it? He was Johnny Apple freedom. He was spreading it. And yet many of the same people who fervently backed the invasion of Iraq now say Arab Spring is a mistake. I don't understand that. It doesn't, that there's no consistency in that in any way, shape, or form, other than a feeling of wanting to control things that no country can control. Nobody's that good, powerful, except China.
Thank you guys so much. What do you guys think is going to be the future of Iran? I mean, as repressive as this regime is, it's a result of a Shah who is a puppet of U.S. and British oil interests. Is there a happy medium that we can find, or should we just go back to the Ottoman Empire? It seemed pretty good.
You don't hear that a lot.
Okay. I was just waiting for a loaded question at the end of it, and
You got
it.
it.
That's really loaded. Yeah, and I think you have all your answers within.
Right.
So maybe one more question before you answer that one. Yeah. I can tweet you the answer. Yeah. Or you can read my book.
By the way, very good book. And the cartoons.
Yeah.
All right, you want to go in the back there, and we'll ask. There's a couple back there, and they seem somewhat enthusiastic.
Thank you. I have a burning question, and that is, what is is there organized opposition in Iran? Does it have a leadership? You know, the Green Movement seemed to be just a spontaneous thing. Was it, or was there leadership? I thought you might know, since you've been on the ground there.
Well, your burning question has a very simple answer. No. So that is, yeah. No, Iranians don't have an organized opposition. There are different groups who are opposing this government to varying degrees. Some of them want to topple this government. Some of them want to reform it. Some of them want to be part of it and change the system from within. But one thing that really makes me hopeful about the future of Iran, and that can answer that gentleman's question as well, is that people are still not thinking about violence in terms of changing the government or overthrowing the government. People are still approaching change in Iran with a certain degree of trepidation. They are afraid of any kind of sudden change in the country. We had a sudden change in Iran 34 years ago. We thought that, I mean, the main slogan of the Iranian Revolution was that when the devil goes out, the angel comes in. Something like a devil went out, but even worse, devil came in. So people don't want sudden changes, and people are still thinking about it, contemplating about what they want in the future.
There's a really interesting moment in Maziar's experience over there. It's when you were filming on, it might have been the day of the Dust and Dirt March, and it was the Basij attack at the base. And Maziar was filming an attack on a besieged base, of what was an incredibly peaceful protest. It was the day, you saw footage of it when the people were walking by and they had signs in English and in Persian saying, we just want our votes heard. And there was an attack on a besieged base where a couple of fire bombs and things like that. And it might have been
Molotov cocktails.
Molotov cocktails, and they didn't think it was the peaceful protesters. It was agitators or somebody. And a boy was shot, and he caught that, and the crowd sort of explodes, and a couple of people shout, "Death to the Islamic Republic." And all the rest of the crowd, and these are all the protesters, this is the Green Movement, turn and go, "What? No, we're trying to get our votes. I don't know who these guys are. These guys are knuckleheads. We don't want these guys." But it speaks to the dynamic that he's talking about, which is these were just ordinary people who came out to say, this seems like this election is fraudulent. We just want our votes counted. This wasn't a time to, like you say, violently overthrow these. These are people that love their religion, that love their country, that all these other things. So I think that spirit is alive, but seems, like you say, doesn't have a focal point.
I think I'm going to have to censor this conversation now. We're running out of time, but thank you all for coming. It was a great conversation.